Most airlines need hundreds of routes to survive. This one needed exactly one. A single corridor across the South Atlantic, generating so much cash that it single-handedly kept a national airline alive, funded an entire European network, and eventually triggered a billion-euro bidding war between three of the most powerful aviation conglomerates on the planet. The airline was TAP Air Portugal. And the question nobody can fully answer is whether that lifeline is about to be cut. TAP Air Portugal is the flag carrier of a country with roughly 10 million people, no massive domestic market, no wealthy business travel corridor. By the mid-2010s, TAP was drowning in over €1 billion of debt, flying aging aircraft and losing money on virtually every European route it operated. Ryanair and EasyJet were selling seats for €20. TAP couldn't compete. The airline was on the same trajectory as Alitalia, which eventually collapsed and had to be reborn as an entirely new carrier. TAP needed a lifeline, and it found one hiding in plain sight on a map. But to understand why it worked, you first need to understand why almost every other European flag carrier was bleeding out at the same time. The 2010s were a bloodbath for legacy airlines in Europe. Ultra-low-cost carriers like Ryanair, EasyJet and Wizz Air had fundamentally broken the economics of short-haul flying. They operated brand-new Boeing 737s and Airbus A320s with ruthless efficiency, offering tickets so cheap that traditional airlines physically could not match them without losing money on every single seat. National flag carriers with expensive union contracts, bloated overhead and aging fleets were getting destroyed, but airlines like Lufthansa had Germany's 83 million people to fall back on. Air France had France's 67 million. These massive domestic populations generated enough business travel and point-to-point demand to keep the lights on even when short-haul margins collapsed. Portugal had none of that. 10 million people, a small economy, and a home airport in Lisbon that low-cost carriers were already invading. TAP had no economic reason to survive, but TAP had something Lufthansa, Air France and British Airways could never replicate, no matter how much money they spent. Pull up a map of Europe. Look at where Lisbon sits. It doesn't just border the Atlantic, it juts out into it like a fist, hundreds of miles west of every other major European capital. Lisbon is the westernmost point of mainland Europe, and in aviation, geography is destiny. A flight from Frankfurt to Fortaleza in northeast Brazil takes roughly 10.5 hours. The same flight from Lisbon takes just over 7. That's not a minor difference. That's thousands of pounds of fuel saved per flight. That's faster turnaround times, meaning each aircraft can fly more trips per week. That's reduced crew costs and less fatigue-related scheduling complexity. Major European competitors flying out of northern hubs have to burn extra hours of fuel that TAP simply doesn't. But here's what made TAP's move brilliant. They didn't use this advantage to fight British Airways and Lufthansa on flights to São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, where every carrier was already engaged in a brutal low-margin price war. They went somewhere nobody else was looking. Brazil has over 200 million people, and most of them don't live in São Paulo or Rio. Cities like Fortaleza, Recife, Salvador, Natal, Belém, and Maceió are massive metropolitan areas with millions of residents each. Historically, if someone in Fortaleza wanted to fly to Europe, they had exactly one realistic option: fly domestically to São Paulo, then connect on a 10-hour flight to London or Paris or Frankfurt. The journey could take 20 hours or more. TAP looked at that and saw a monopoly waiting to be built. They launched direct flights from Lisbon to these secondary Brazilian cities, one after another: Fortaleza, then Recife, then Salvador, then Natal. The list kept growing until TAP was operating flights to 11 different Brazilian destinations, over 80 departures per week across the South Atlantic. If you lived anywhere in northern or northeastern Brazil and wanted to reach Europe, flying through Lisbon wasn't just convenient, it was the only logical option. But the monopoly on Brazilian secondary cities was only half the strategy. The other half was even more calculated. TAP's European network, dozens of short-haul routes to cities like Rome, Berlin, London and Amsterdam, barely broke even on paper. Against Ryanair, those routes were financial sinkholes, so why keep flying them? Because those European flights weren't the product, they were the conveyor belt. TAP's entire short-haul operation existed for one purpose: to scoop up European passengers and funnel them into Lisbon's hub just in time for the afternoon and evening bank of wide-body departures to Brazil. A tourist in Munich wanting to visit Recife would fly TAP to Lisbon, connect in 2 hours, and land in Brazil the same evening. No other airline on Earth could offer that itinerary. The massive profits generated over the South Atlantic literally cross-subsidized every thin European route on TAP's network. Pull out the Brazil corridor and the entire airline collapses like a house of cards. Then TAP weaponized the technology to make this advantage even more lethal. TAP became the global launch customer for the Airbus A330neo, the most fuel-efficient widebody available, deploying it on high-demand trunk routes to São Paulo and Rio. But the real masterstroke was the Airbus A321LR, a long-range narrow-body jet. Competitors physically needed 300-seat widebody aircraft to carry enough fuel to cross the Atlantic from their more distant hubs. TAP's geographic cheat code in Lisbon meant they could fly a 171-seat single-aisle jet across the ocean to cities like Belém and Natal. The economics were devastating for the competition. A narrow-body costs dramatically less per trip to operate. TAP only needed to find roughly 150 passengers to make a flight highly profitable, allowing year-round service to cities that could never sustain a bulky Boeing 777. Route after route, city after city, TAP locked competitors out of markets they didn't even know existed. The strategy didn't just save the airline, it turned a bankrupt national carrier into the most strategically valuable aviation asset in Europe, and that's when the real war started. The Portuguese government announced plans to privatize TAP, and the response was immediate and ferocious. 3 of Europe's largest aviation conglomerates, Lufthansa Group, Air France, KLM, and IAG, the parent company of British Airways and Iberia, launched a high-stakes bidding war, but none of them were fighting over TAP's aging lounges or its brand recognition in Portugal. They were fighting over one thing: the keys to the Lisbon-Brazil corridor. Whoever acquires TAP instantly inherits a near monopoly on Europe to South America traffic flowing through secondary Brazilian cities. For Lufthansa, it means feeding passengers from across its Star Alliance network through Lisbon to destinations no Frankfurt flight could ever reach economically. For Air France KLM, it plugs a gaping hole in their South Atlantic strategy. For IAG, it's existential because their subsidiary Iberia sits in Madrid, just 300 miles east, and they're already trying to build their own South American hub. Buying TAP would eliminate the competition overnight. The bidding war confirmed what the industry had quietly known for years. TAP's golden route wasn't just profitable, it was irreplaceable. But here's where everything TAP built starts to face threats that could unravel the entire model. IAG didn't just bid for TAP, it hedged. Iberia has been aggressively expanding Madrid's connections to Latin America, partnering with LATAM Airlines to build a competing South American gateway. Madrid sits close enough to Lisbon that with the right aircraft and the right partnerships, it could siphon transfer traffic away from TAP's hub. Passengers connecting in Madrid instead of Lisbon means fewer bodies filling TAP's wide bodies across the Atlantic. That alone would be a serious problem, but the real existential threat isn't another airline, it's an airplane. The Airbus A321XLR, the extra long-range variant, is entering service now, and it changes everything about TAP's competitive moat. The A321LR gave TAP the ability to fly narrow bodies across the Atlantic because Lisbon was close enough. The XLR extends that range by another 1,000 nautical miles. Suddenly, airlines based in Paris, Madrid, or even London can fly a single-aisle jet directly to Fortaleza or Recife without stopping in Lisbon at all. The geographic cheat code that saved TAP could be erased by the very type of aircraft technology TAP pioneered. Iberia has already ordered the A321XLR. So has Aer Lingus, another IAG subsidiary. JetBlue, Wizz Air, and a dozen other carriers are lining up. If competitors crack TAP's secondary city Brazilian monopoly with direct narrow-body flights from their own hubs, the funnel breaks. European passengers no longer need Lisbon. The feeder routes lose their purpose. The cross-subsidization model collapses. TAP's leadership knows this. The privatization isn't just about finding a buyer, it's about finding a partner with the scale and network to keep the Lisbon hub relevant even as competitors gain the range to bypass it. A Lufthansa acquisition would bring Star Alliance feed traffic from across Europe and North America, thickening the Lisbon hub with connections TAP could never generate alone. An IAG acquisition would likely do the opposite, slowly redirecting South American traffic toward Madrid and reducing Lisbon to a secondary spoke. The wrong buyer doesn't just change TAP's strategy, it could kill the airline's reason to exist. And there's one more detail that makes this story impossible to resolve cleanly. The Portuguese government injected over €3 billion of taxpayer money into TAP during the pandemic to keep it alive. Portuguese citizens effectively own this airline and the corridor it depends on. Selling TAP to a foreign conglomerate means handing that strategic asset, the single most valuable piece of Portugal's aviation infrastructure, to a foreign board of directors who may have zero incentive to protect Lisbon's hub status. Every major airline merger in European history has eventually led to route consolidation and hub rationalization. Alitalia was absorbed, Swissair was dismantled, Sabena vanished. The pattern is clear, and the Portuguese public knows it. So TAP sits at the center of a paradox. The route that saved the airline made it too valuable to remain independent, but selling it to the wrong buyer could destroy the very corridor that makes it worth buying. Meanwhile, every month that passes, another competitor takes delivery of an A321XLR, and Lisbon's geographic advantage shrinks by another few hundred nautical miles. Whether TAP's golden route survives the next decade depends entirely on decisions being made right now in boardrooms in Lisbon, Frankfurt, Paris, and Madrid by people who may never set foot on a flight to Fortaleza. The story of how one route saved an entire country's airline might not have a happy ending. If you want to understand the technology that made all of this possible, watch this video next.